This podcast contains potentially adult language, adult themes, definitely drinking, and possibly sexual context. Listener discretion is advised. Okay, so welcome to Drinking with Authors. I'm your host, Erica Lance. With me, as always, is
Valerie Willis.
And today, our epic guest is Valerie.
David Brin.
David Brin. Woo! Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we're drinking first, because we always do that. So me and Val decided to drink a warm apple cider with honey jack in it, because we're in Florida and that just seems ridiculous. So that's what we decided to do. David, what are you drinking with us today?
Well, I'm starting out with homebrewed iced tea. It's rather warm here, though in California we don't have your humidity. But I am going to have a sip, even though it's before noon, of a couple of items. One is Johnny Walker Swing.
Yes.
It was 25 years old when I bought it 20 years ago.
Oh my goodness.
Wow. So it's on its way towards being 50.
Oh, wow.
And this is simply the civilized drink. It's port.
Oh, wow.
So,
Wow.
you know, port and sherry are so civilized. But, you know, it's important that that viewers remember that until the invention of distillation, fortified wines like sherry and port were about as strong as you could get. And there were various ways to fortify them. One was to leave them out in the cold of winter. Water ice would form on the surface. You'd scoop out the water ice and throw it away. And what was left was alcohol fortified wine. Not as strong as distilled, but still people, it became a tradition. So Sláinte, partly because our daughter is in Scotland working on her PhD.
Awesome. Congratulations.
So grab a piece of paper to take notes. And we were already talking about apocalypses. And Valerie and Erica are going to have links underneath this to various things. So
so you obviously have been a prolific writer for a long time. What got you started in writing?
Well, let's see. I always knew I'd be a writer. I mean, I was born to be. My father, his father, and rumor had it his father before him were all writers. My mother was highly literate. No, I felt the writing bug from the beginning, and I knew that I would write. But let me back off and say that science fiction was very poorly named. It sounds very, very nerdy, and only about 10% of scientists, of science fiction authors are scientists, as I am. Though some of the English majors who became science fiction authors actually do the hard stuff, the hard scientific science fiction so well. Kim Stanley Robinson, Nancy Kress, Linda Nagata, Emily Davenport, Greg Bear. These are all people who could not parse a differential equation if they were tutored at it for 100 years.
In that vein.
But they nevertheless write excellent extrapolative hard science fiction because they know the trick. Live near a university and bribe the experts that you need with pizza and beer. It's the cheapest consulting rate possible, and usually you can get away with a Tuckerization.
Oh, wow.
Just promise to mention them in the book and they'll pay for the pizza and beer as well as correcting all of your errors in the scientific aspect. So having said that, I'm going to garrulously come around circle. Having said that, I believe that what science fiction should have been named is speculative history.
Oh.
Because the thing that almost all science fiction authors share is not so much a love of science. As a matter of fact, some of the leading science fiction today gives an impression of being somewhat hostile to science. No, it is an obsession with history. Far greater percentage of science fiction authors read and absorb and dwell in history. And this includes fantasy authors as well, even though the mother genre, fantasy, is morally and psychically diverged from its daughter, science fiction. And we can talk about that later. But the mother genre goes back to Gilgamesh, Achilles, you know, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Lady Murasaki, you know, and the tale of Genji, Scholar Wu, and Journey to the West. All fantasies that share some common traits that we can talk about. But the mother genre and the daughter genre share an obsession with history. And why science fiction? Science fiction is different in the way it obsesses in history. Science fiction is about taking the horrible, most tristesse, most poignant story of them all. And that's humanity's climb out of mud and caves, 3 steps forward, 4 steps back, 2 to the side. Horrible errors made sometimes by oppressive males enforcing feudalism and grabbing harems, but also horrible mistakes made by countless ancestors who had the best of intentions, who simply had a wrong image of what was going on, and sometimes only partially wrong, moving us a little bit ahead while moving to the side. This is the story. This is the story. Us climbing out. And it may be the first time that it's happened in the galaxy.
Wow.
In any event, and that's a whole other topic, science fiction, unlike fantasy, extrapolates this path plausibly ahead. And that's what the prefrontal lobes are for. The prefrontal lobes, these nubs above the eyes, this is what they were talking about in the Bible when they spoke of Moses having lamps on his brow. This phrase confused biblical scholars for 2,000 years. And now we're pretty sure it's about the prefrontal lobes because these are the nubs above the eyes that help us to extrapolate, to put ourselves in the shoes of others. So it's the seat of empathy.
Right.
But also to extrapolate, what if I did this? What if I mentioned this at the business meeting tomorrow? What if I propose this? What might the reactions be? What if I stick these 2 gimmicks, gewgaws together? What if I try to run this yellow light? And I assure you, ladies, you probably are among those who have empathized with and tried to understand men. You have no idea how often these prefrontal lobes combine with other parts of the brain that are less mature and imagine doing things, and that how many times a day the answer is no.
No. No.
No, we're not doing that. No, we're not doing that. And my wife has told me many times before, she has said, I understand these thought experiments go through your head, and I'm not going to try to punish you or police you for having them. You are descended from horrible guys who had harems. We're all descended from the harems of these guys. So it's males imagine that they have that coming. I'm not responsible for the things that fizz back there. So,
I do not hold myself accountable for the things I imagine half the time because I get that ghosted look and they're like, what you're thinking about? I'm like, you don't want to know.
And multiply that. But she says, if you behave well, you deserve to breed. just behave well and be trainable when you don't.
Oh.
Okay, Authority. Now, we've come around to talk about speculative history, right? Science fiction extrapolates into possible futures. Warnings, dire warnings. The greatest of all science fiction is the self-preventing prophecy. Prophecies that make themselves not come true because they stirred people into becoming activists to prevent it.
Do you think?
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because you say that, is there a works you think created that effect largely when you're talking about that?
Absolutely. Soylent Green recruited millions of environmentalists. The fact that we might avoid such a future barely means that without the warnings that recruited millions of people, Kate Wilhelm's Where Late the Sweet Birds Sing, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, so many ecological warnings, the movie Silent Running. Now, how about Black Like Me and The Invisible Man, the other one, for helping people realize that we're on a long slog of race relations. The granddaddy of them all is 1984.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Had huge effects on the American psyche, which was already lectured to by Hollywood, almost every Hollywood film. The principal messages are, number one of all, suspicion of authority. There has to be some authority figure to generate conflict. Either it's invading aliens or it could be a mother-in-law. But there is suspicion of authority, tolerance, diversity, and appreciation of eccentricity. If you look at the movies you've enjoyed most, the principal character usually exhibits some eccentric trait. And it doesn't have to be the audience member's eccentric trait. The fact that they're exhibiting eccentricity helps to bond with them and helps to spread the notion that eccentricity is to be appreciated. Now, these are extremely unusual messages for a nation to preach to its young people. And the only complaint I have about the young people out there toppling statues and all of that is, you think you invented this? You were taught, you suckled these values from the most relentless propaganda campaign the world has ever seen. And name for me another great nation that ever lectured relentlessly young people criticize us. Because that's how we find our mistakes. Cito Kate, criticism is the only known antidote to error. It's how this experiment has done so much better than the few other Periclean experiments. Periclean Athens, Florence, the Republic of Florence. The greatest discovery that has enabled us to keep moving forward and get over errors, and God willing, we'll get rid of, I'm sorry, not get rid of.
It's okay. If we're an adult podcast,
Yeah.
you can swear.
Yeah,
This is
no,
awesome. You
no.
can say any word.
Oh, seriously,
Yeah.
rainbow babes. Seriously, rainbow babes. Yeah, I'm in real danger of misspeaking when I say get rid of. No, that's how we correct errors, and God willing, we'll correct some recent errors fairly soon. By the way, we're among friends here, so I did not just misspeak, right?
No, not at all.
All right. So the point is, the self-preventing prophecy, the granddaddy of them was 1984, because it fed into and leveraged on suspicion of authority, but in an absolutely terrifying, supreme way. And in normal times, the difference the difference between the difference between a decent citizen of the left and a decent citizen of the right is only which direction you suspect is trying to become Big Brother.
That's true.
A liberal generally suspects that it's conniving aristocrats and faceless corporations. A conservative has a point when she points and says, "I'm worried about snooty academics and faceless government bureaucrats." Now, is one of these directions vastly more dangerous than the others? The other now? Absolutely. But the worst thing that's happened to us is that we've lost the ability to even say, I think the authorities I'm worried about are worse, but I'm glad you're keeping an eye on mine.
No, that's true. That's true.
And that has been destroyed.
No, totally. So it's interesting you say that, because while you were saying that, it caused me to think, like, I grew up, you know, I was at the opening of Star Wars, so that tells my age, right? I was 3, but I was still at the opening of Star Wars, and I tell people, because it was at the Chinese Man Theater in California, I lived there, and I tell people that, like, everybody's like, oh, it's this big deal, and they see the video, and I'm like, no, you don't understand. Everybody thought it was the, like, weirdest thing in the world. These droids, this giant Wookiee that was there, like, nobody kind of got what was going on completely at that moment in time, you know? For us kids, it was like the coolest thing in the world, but a lot of adults were like, what is happening right there?
Blade Runner is a perfect example where everything happened right, because when it was first released, it was too mind-boggling, and it absolutely needed Harrison Ford's voiceovers. Even though we thought they were artistically awful. 10 years later, everybody understood Blade Runner. Director comes in, removes the voiceovers. We know exactly what's going on. We don't need Harrison Ford to tell us that Rutger Hauer, all he wanted was somebody to be with him when he died.
Yeah.
Don't need to be told that. It's one of the greatest moments in the history of all human art.
Yes. No, I totally agree. I think it's interesting, because when you were saying what you were saying, I grew up as a nerd. I played Dungeons and Dragons before, you know, when we were being hunted down because we were causing murders and stuff, you know, playing Dungeons and Dragons. And it's true. Like, for a while, they thought people who played these games, all this. And then as these movies started coming out, like Thor and all of the, you know, Iron Man, it started becoming more and more cool to be a nerd.
Yeah.
Like, gaming started to be more and more cool. A lot of comic books, graphic novels started to become more and more cool. They weren't the weird kids that lived in their parents' basements that collected comic books, you know? Like, and it's funny, because that's a societal change brought about by what you're talking about. It's brought about by changes in movie, in that it's cool to be these things, right?
Well, one of the things that is featured in our current culture war, and I've gotten some people angry at me, because I have, you know, I went to an all-black high school, and my father marched with King. I'm totally with the entire process here, but the oligarchy is not obsessed with the powerless. They're obsessed with power. And if you look at the fraction of time Fox heads spend attacking races or genders, it is far less than the time they spend attacking nerds. Because nerds have power, you see. Sure, the nerds are suffering personally less than the races and the genders. They're not the great victims. They're not the ones suffering. So let's make this very clear. We need to be angry and forceful, because those who are suffering need the most reforms.
Yeah.
But let's separate that from who the villains think are their main enemy. They're using racism and sexism and all of that as dog whistles to rile up their Confederate masses. But to be honest, I don't think John, I mean, he's been proving it, John Roberts. I don't think that the Mercers, the Murdochs, I don't think that they are personally obsessed with race. Why should they be? Why should they be obsessed with repressing LGBTQ? These are just tools to them. What they're obsessed with is power. So it is the nerds who are the ones who have to be destroyed. And then you see this in the attempts to rile up hatred of the deep state.
Mm-hmm.
And these are the people who saved us from Hitler and Stalin and bin Laden. And finally, the chickens are coming home to roost. The United States Military Officer Corps is making clear that they're just fed up.
Yeah.
But no, I shouldn't have gone directly into politics. I continued to
Like we went left. I appreciate that.
Let me. I want to ask you a question. So we were talking about you were telling us that you come from a family of writers.
And that's what I was going to come back to.
Right.
Okay.
Were you the first in your family to take the adventure to science fiction?
Oh, absolutely. Look, getting back to taking all this full circle, I was a kind of a nerd. I knew I'd be a writer, and I read a lot more history than science. But having said all the things I've said, the context of 6,000 years of grinding horror, in which what was logical and true never mattered as much as the delusions of the few males at the top who had the power to make horrible mistakes, while the peasants and the people suffered the consequences. Across all that time, very rarely there were glimmers of moments when decisions were made not based upon delusions, but upon finding out what was actually true. And here I was, a child of Sputnik, looking around and seeing in that context what Americans still don't see when they look around, when they look at the flag, when they look at this grindingly slow but inexorable arc of justice that Martin Luther King talked about. For the first time in the history of the world, a great nation was investing a huge fraction of its treasure on developing people who were dedicated to competitively, therefore you can get past delusions, finding out what actually was true. And in the context of history, I looked at that and I said, I got to be part of that. I have got to be part of that. So, I had some gift at science, and I got recruited into Caltech, and I got my undergraduate degree, barely. And then I went on, I worked for Hughes Aircraft, Hughes Aircraft as an engineer, and then a Nobel Prize winner recruited me into his group at UCSD, and I got my PhD, and that was really good, solid work. You can go out tonight and look at a comet and say, that's David's doctoral dissertation. I figured out how comets work. Having said all that, I also plugged away at a hobby, because all the scientists I know have artistic hobbies. I was told that I saw Einstein play the violin when I was 4.
Oh, wow.
I heard Richard Feynman play the bongo drums spectacularly well. And he also stole my date at a dance. And I got to tell you, I got more mileage out of just saying that one sentence than any amount that I was irked. My hobby was writing stories, and I was very systematic. I workshopped. And so as a result, my very first submission of my very first work was immediately accepted for 3 times the normal rate. That's not your usual collecting rejection slip story.
Yeah.
So it's a little hard. I have advice articles, which you guys will post, to help young authors, and I do it more than most people do. But the one thing I don't give advice about is how to keep your morale while accepting rejection, because sorry, I don't have any history there. I did notice, though, we just republished that first novel, Sundiver, and my very first character ever to be published was half African and half Native American mestizo. This was 1976. So
Wow.
if nobody else is going to give me one of these, I'm going to. So, and what I tell young authors, and it's in my advice there, is that no matter what genre you want to work in, make your first work a murder mystery.
Oh, wow.
Oh, it's absolutely essential, because you don't learn plotting in any other genre. In a murder mystery, you have to plot the arc of revelations well, because there's no way you can hide your failure. You're in a sadomasochistic relationship, and the reader has to hate himself or herself for just barely missing the revelation of whodunit. If they do know in advance, they're disappointed. If they see what it is, whodunit, and it doesn't make any sense, they'll hate your guts.
True.
You have to time it right. And in a romance novel, you can always hide your plot failures with some more. In a fantasy story, you can throw in one more unicorn or dragon. In science fiction, you can go wee. But a murder mystery, and Sundiver was a science fiction murder mystery. The first victim gets dumped into the sun, which makes CSI really hard.
I would think that would be hard CSI.
Yeah.
So we have come full circle, and I'm sorry I jabbered so much, but you can see how many things I had to weave together in order to answer one simple question.
Wow. So we got one question done. Click. But what we're going to do real quick, because we're almost at the 30-minute mark, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back, and we're going to talk about the Postman right after this.
Sample locally sourced, quality distilled spirits in the beautiful Columbia River Gorge. At Skunk Brothers Distillery, we're family owned, brewing small batch grain to bottle spirits, just like our grandfather did back in the Prohibition era. From handcrafted bourbons and moonshine to flavored blends and cordials infused with local fruit. Join us for a tasting tour and buy Skunk Brothers spirits straight from the source.
It's all in the family at Skunk Brothers Spirits, located in Stevenson, Washington.
And we're back with David Brin. We want to talk about the Postman a little bit. Can we talk about the Postman a little bit?
As you see, we have, well, no, they can't see, can they?
No, they can't see. You just gesture to the, okay.
No.
You are really pretty when you drink.
Oh, I don't drink unless I'm on the podcast,
Yes.
so I'm a hot mess all the time.
She is. It's part of the joy. Unlike me, I have Irish descent. I'm like, what is this? We need some more shots. Let's go. So let's talk about the Postman. You wrote the Postman, right? What did you?
I'm the front for a guy who's very shy. I like to stop. I wrote the Postman.
Oh, I was like, what? Quick, write down this revelation. Okay, so the Postman, and it gets opted for a movie. How did that go down?
Well, first off, the Postman is a reflection of my upbringing, afraid of nuclear war, afraid that we're going to lose everything that has made life for the first time in all the history of our species, at least somewhat gracious, with self-improvement and always on our agenda. So I was tired of what's called the Mad Max scenario, the lone hero or with a sidekick, is saving the day through leaping and hopping. And the interesting thing is the first three Mad Max movies, not the horrible recent one, but the first three Mad Max movies weren't Mad Max movies because, in fact, they were thoughtful about civilization, and Max would give his life to help bring it back. But it occurred to me that that we live in a civilization that is simultaneously competitive and collaborative, and it has to be both because you have to collaborate over rules to prevent the cheating that ruins competition. I wanted to tell a story of a hero who does some heroic things, but the principal thing that he's able to do, much to his own surprise, is to remind the survivors that they had once been mighty beings called citizens. And that if they could gather their force of will and their cooperativeness and competitiveness, inspired by the right notions, that they, people, thousands of them, tens of thousands, might actually be able to pull something out of the fire. And in my opinion, that is a vastly more important and long-lasting way to get out of calamity. And I have to tell you that my feelings about the Kevin Costner movie are very mixed, but one thing is paramount, and that is that aspect, which is the heart of my story, he utterly nailed. He and the screenwriter Brian Helgeland, the heart message that a flawed and even sometimes cowardly fellow could find a way to remind everybody else what they once had been. Utterly there. And especially given that the first three screenplays commissioned by Warner Brothers were just evil, just totally reversed every moral point I was trying to make. For all of the flaws in Costner's treatment, both of the flick and of me, I felt like a guy who had been beaten up with broken bottles by a gang in a dark alley, and a guy comes along and beats them up, sends them packing, stitches my worst wounds, stands me up, hands me a beer, and then says, "Would you mind if I berate you about the lower legs with a rattan stick?"
Oh.
Knock yourself out, man.
So
Be a guest. Ow.
So it's a brutal thing to have to endure as an author, trying to watch your baby essentially cross into that other realm of media.
Well, he was not very nice to me at all. I was barely given the minimal courtesies. I never even had a beer with him. You'd think that he'd take me out to dinner once, but that doesn't matter as much.
did they approach you for this? So
Yes, instantly, as soon as the book was out, my agent then, he's no longer my agent, said, "This is your one chance, sign right now." And for the next 10 years, every 3 months, someone would call me up saying, "Let's work together." Da, 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 da. Richard Dreyfuss, for example, would have been a great little film. No, this was very, very frustrating. And mind you, I do believe that though he held on to the heart, he scooped out and threw away most of the brains. There are many parts of the book that he didn't include that I would not include in a movie. Talking computers and augmented muscles and things like I would have made exactly the same decision. I think it's tragic that he didn't get feedback about the last 20 minutes of the film, because I think it left everybody with a bad impression. Also, in probably the worst example of movie timing in the history of cinema, he said, our timing is perfect. We're bringing out this Christmas movie, and the only competition we have is Cameron's silly remake about a sinking boat.
The Titanic?
He brought it out the same weekend as Titanic.
That was super dumb. That was super. I forgot that it came out at that time.
Yeah.
Mainly because I didn't go see it in the theater. You know, I have to say, like, Kevin Costner, like, I love Dancing with Wolves. I thought it was brilliant. But after that, these movies he started making, I was like, why do people keep giving this man money? Like, this is ridiculous. They're so long. And Waterworld is one of my worst. I hate Waterworld. I think Waterworld was one of the worst movies ever made.
And quite frankly, evil as well. But it has the opposite sensibility about civilization to the Postman.
Yeah.
I have to tell you that there's something else about that movie, and that is that I think that Kevin Costner is probably one of the most brilliant cinematographers in the history of cinema. I think that his movies are absolutely drop-dead gorgeous. I think this film is musically and visually one of the dozen most beautiful ever shot. So what do we have here? We have gorgeous, big-hearted, and dumb. But you see, that's what my wife married.
Gorgeous, big-hearted, dumb. I love it.
And so, may you suffer the way I suffered, and have a movie that you get asked to bitch about, and you get to be very forgiving and understanding. I mean, it's really not the worst thing ever to happen to anybody because it's morally okay.
Yeah. It's true. We talked to Jonathan Mayberry about this, and also
his series V Wars.
Yeah, his series V Wars, and talking about also like Stephen King, because a lot of Stephen King's remakes I look at and I go, oh God, I'd be so mad as the author. I would just be mad. But he just goes, here, go, do your thing. Like, he doesn't seem to. And Jonathan Mayberry was like, I just let him do it. I would have done stuff differently, but I just let him do it. And it's kind of interesting because they obviously sent you some of the scripts and stuff like that. Did part of you ever just go, you know what? You guys just go do whatever. I'm going to sit over here and pretend like none of that is happening.
No, I can't do that. I care. I care about story. Various people are the best at various things. For instance, Frederick Pohl was probably the greatest science fiction author. Poul Anderson was the greatest storyteller I ever knew, which is why all of his Hugos and Nebulas were in the novella category, because the novella is the natural arc of something the storyteller would tell by the campfire in the old days of the caves and the tribes. And so his great novels were strung together novellas, and that was the same style of my most mythic story, which is The Postman. Pohl had one movie. It was a German make of one of the blatantly, most obviously movieable things that this great storyteller ever told, and that's called The High Crusade. Basically, an alien spaceship lands in Britain as the local baron is getting his troop ready to go join Richard the Lionheart in the Crusades. And the big ramp comes down and the aliens start shooting, and the knights just charge up the ramp into the ship, kill all but one of the aliens, and they have a starship. And they wipe. It's a wonderful, wonderful concept.
Sounds like something out of Monty Python, honestly. That's what it sounds like to me.
The point that the Germans tried to make it funny and they failed utterly. Now, comedy is hard. I have a new comedy novel.
Oh.
That none of my regular publishers wanted to publish because they're terrified of comedy. And I'm hoping that Erica and Valerie will post a link so people can sample the first 3 chapters. And if they think it's har funny, they can buy the rest cheap. We also just got the rights back to a dozen of my books under the 1978 Copyright Act. Bantam Random House had never heard, their lawyers had never even heard of this.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow.
No other authors who had multiple books under the same contract for 35 years. That Copyright Act was written in response to Schuster and Siegel being screwed on Superman.
Oh.
And so it says after 35 years, no matter what your original contract says, if you're still under that original contract, you can get your rights back. So I got back all the Uplift books, and they're all going to be reissued by Open Road. Now,
the Uplift series won several Hugos and Nebulas.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah.
And dolphins in space.
Hey, I like to echo the dolphin. Okay, I'm big.
Oh, I wrote the.
Yes.
That's a beautiful game. I have had so much bad luck. Things that should have been great big openings for the whole thing. It's the best game that was ever on the Dreamcast. But now it's been ported over to various things. But I wrote the outer thing, and people are giving me credit for Death Stranding, but giving me no money. Half of the reviews of Death Stranding mentioned the Postman.
Oh, wow.
It's half of all reviews mentioning the Postman. You know that I really should at least have gotten a dinner.
I think more people need to take you to dinner and give you a beer. I feel like there's a dinner beer disparity happening.
I'm so bitter and obviously so impoverished.
Yes.
Yeah. And absolutely no sense of self-perspective whatsoever.
No, not at all.
So, we've been bouncing. Oh, yes. So Open Road is going to reissue the Uplift books, except Sundiver, which we just reissued ourselves. I went through it and did a re-edit for the first time in 40 years. We just finished a re-edit of The Postman and The Practice Effect. And as soon as Patrick Farley, who I totally underrated web comic artist, who I'm going to link to, as soon as he gives us the covers, those two will also be on my website in somewhat re-edited edited form.
How was that? How was it like revisiting? So we talk about that a lot on the podcast, that some people have a hard time releasing their book, and going through, they keep editing and editing, they can't almost stop themselves. And then we talked to a lot of people, Jeff Strand, other people that talk about never wanting to touch the book again. Like they're done. They don't want to look at it again.
Writers are all very different. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, but it's also because of the rhythm and cycle. Robert Heinlein, for example, was extremely good at openings. He would start novels extremely well. They would reach a peak and a climax, a dramatic climax, somewhere around the middle of the book, and then peter out into talk, and yawning through the entire last half of the book. Which, ironically, his best book, Beyond This Horizon, which is his prescriptive utopia, had that same pattern, except the dramatic first part was absolute garbage, and the talk part in the second half was wonderful. We should have collaborated, because for me, I never know what I'm doing in a story. I flounder around the first scenes and chapters, and then flounder, and then rewrite and circulate to a large coterie of pre-readers and get feedback, and then rewrite the first fifth, build momentum, write the second fifth, and circulate it again, get more feedback, rewrite the first two fifths, write the third fifth. And now I think I'm starting to understand what this story is about. The last quarter of the book is no problem whatsoever. I blaze through those. I know how to end things. If you hang with any of my novels till the end, they'll end well. And that's why they get the least rewrite. Whereas the first fifth has been rewritten 5 times. But you see, that's not the same kind of perfectionism that you were talking about. I'm willing to let go. I'm willing to hand it over. It's just, part of the process to getting to the end, to understanding this thing, is rewriting the beginning many times. And that's where I'm weakest. So it's a pattern that works for me, except for one problem.
Okay.
Getting started.
Wow. Okay.
I have the first 2 chapters of my grand Uplift finale. And I'm not rolling along on it. So it's because I keep getting distracted lately by politics, by political blogs. You'll link to, let's see here, my political book that I've put out called Polemical Judo has advice for our side in this the Union side in this civil war, and it's gained no traction whatsoever. And if 1 out of 100 of these ideas were put into play, it would be Gettysburg.
Okay.
This is my
Ancient Ones.
This is my comedy with a lovely jocular Patrick Farley cover. So I forget where I was. It's senility.
You were talking about starting books. I love this. This is totally drinking with authors.
Yeah.
And we're going left. And where are we now? We don't know. We left our map behind. So when you obviously are not a plotter then, because if you don't know where the story's going, how do you get inspired? Like, what makes you go,
People will say it's the character that is entrancing. People will say it's the science fiction scenario. People will say it's the underlying social problems. I've done them all. I worked from outline, for instance, when I finished Isaac Asimov's Foundation and Robots universe in Foundation's Triumph, I had a responsibility. I reread even obscure books like Pebble in the Sky and The Currents of Space. And I had a Poul Anderson absolute fetish with the story, Isaac's story. And people have said, Janet Asimov said, that I tied together his loose ends very well. And for that, I had to work from an outline. And for Heart of the Comet, my collaboration with Gregory Benford, we worked from an outline. Generally, I don't, because, as I said, I need to get through this cycle in order to really know what's going on in the story.
Where did you get the idea? So the idea hit you for like the Postman. Where did you go, you know what, I'm going to write a book about this?
In that particular case, I had read a post-apocalyptic story in Analog that day, and I thought, what would I do if this character next? And I had a little fantasy, and I thought, dang. In some cases, like Earth and existence, it's an attempt to extrapolate a world of 30 years from now, which is the hardest stretch of time to extrapolate. And some of my fans keep a wiki tracking successful predictions from Earth. But along with many others of my colleagues, I have to say, prediction is not our main concern. I happen to have an extremely good score. But as I said, the self-preventing prophecy is vastly more important. So giving warnings that actually effectively help to cancel out the thing you're warning about, that's much more powerful. So it's different with each book. With probably my most fun novels, The Practice Effect and Kiln People, K-I-L-N, they're made of clay.
Yeah.
Those were, until the Ancient Ones, until I published this comedy, these were my most fun books, people say. And those were classic, here's a gimmick, how much fun can I have with this gimmick? And in the practice effect, it's a fairly straightforward, simple adventure story gimmick, all that sort of thing. I'm pleased to say that in doing these rewrites 30, 35 years later, the amount of political correctness surgery that I had to do was extremely small. Oh, in one case, that the character is talking about a colleague he deeply respects and arguing with her as an equal, but he mentally notes that she fills out a bikini well. Gone. Gone. Gone, 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 gone. It was 1976, and I expect to be forgiven.
Well, I don't even think it's bad now.
I mean,
no. But mostly, almost nothing. The principal character in existence is bisexual, you know, and all of that. But in Killing People, it was just one idea. What if you could make cheap, one-day copies of yourself that had all your memories, and especially you could download the memories at the end of the day? Well, then you could be 5 different yous and then reconverge at the end of the day. And then the one added thing, and that is I almost always give the new thing to everybody, because too many sci-fi plots are saying, here's the new thing, and the rich are monopolizing it, or the evil one is monopolizing it, or all that sort of thing. I try to give it to everybody because that's what we've done. And we're so interesting.
It's very true. Let's talk a moment, because we have a few more minutes of this podcast. Let's talk about your fans. So one thing we've become acutely aware of. So I write horror under one name, and I write erotica under another name, and Val writes like fantasy, paranormal,
mythology,
and then
paranormal, and then erotica under another name as well.
But sci-fi fans, sci-fi fans are a different beast than our fans. Even like my fans for the horror genre, because none of my stories have happy endings. But science fiction fans tend to like really kind of call you on your stuff. Like they, you know, we had one of our authors is writing a time thing between 2 dimensions, and she's like, I'm trying to figure out the math. I'm like, don't figure out the math, be vague, because you'll be sitting on a panel and some nerd in the audience will stand up and call you out on the math things wrong with your time differential.
Just say there's a variable that swings it right and left.
Yes. And so
you tell her that I said don't listen to you.
Okay, I will today, actually. I'm like, listen, we interviewed David Brin. He told me to stop it. You go ahead and do you dear. What do you think fan-wise, though? Because you're obviously a fan of no, it's not science fiction. It's speculative history. I'm not going to call it science fiction. But you're a fan of speculative history. What do you think of the fans of speculative history?
I think it's wonderful. It's probably the best tribe in all the history of the world to be a member of. It's the first tribe in all of the history that has said to its children, think different. You know, a child in our tribe goes up to the parent and says, I'm not going to recite the same catechism as you. I'm going to come up with new stuff. And the parent's response is, ooh.
Yeah.
You know, that's a kind of a different religious obsession, and I think it's wonderful. I mentioned my pre-readers. I circulate everything. Very, very broadly, because the greatest tool for success that any person can nurture is to look upon criticism as something as food. For one thing, if you take it that way, then your biggest critics, who are your enemies, who will leap to criticize you, suddenly become your allies. They are telling you all this stuff that's wrong with you, and you're going, huh, all right, well, that's bullshit. You're an idiot. Wait a minute, these 2 items. Ooh, God, I hadn't thought of that. I'm going to fix those, and that'll help me to defeat you. Thanks.
That's a really great way of looking at it.
the point is that I've just explained human history, that horrible horror of human history, because the one thing that could have enabled ruling castes to rule better is to listen to those who say, Your Emperorness, I hear they have snow in Russia. Maybe we shouldn't invade. If the one thing that would enable you to rule well is the one thing that these ruling castes obsessively repressed. And we're seeing that in the war on nerds, the war on journalism, the war on science, the war on all the fact professions today. And it's resulting in very bad governance. Well, so to get back to the point, I circulate everything. I get feedback, and sometimes it is, you're an idiot. But very often, if you failed, if 3 or more, certainly possibly 2 or more of your pre-readers offer you the same, even if they misunderstood what you wrote, then that's your fault.
We had that conversation not too long ago where it's the editor is your first line of discovering that aspect sometimes. Like, that's why it's so important to have an editor involved, because what you think you laid on the page and what is read and absorbed from the page can sometimes flip on you or flip on the reader. And if you have an editor and the editor didn't understand where you were going with it, you got to take that step back and rewrite.
Before you have editors, take community college creative writing classes, if we ever get back to normal. I took 6 or 7 while I was writing, learning to write. And in every case, I could have taught the class better than the teacher. But what it did is it gave me a weekly deadline, 10 pages per week, and civilians to read what I wrote.
Critique.
And if I could get them to understand what I was writing, then I could get a science fiction reader to understand what I was writing. So at the end of 10 weeks, you have 100 pages and you have a deadline. So the thing is that their tricks, Valerie and Erica will, I'm sorry, that's the order I gave them last time. Erica and Valerie screaming from the gallery. Oh, you hate that. I'm sorry.
No,
it's fine.
My uncle used to call me Ballerina, and I used to cry about it. So, because I was a tomboy growing up.
Well, but you don't mind Maxwell.
No. And of course, my husband appreciates my love for fishing. So.
Well, you can link to my article of advice for new writers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're always happy to pass on advice columns and stuff like that, because and that's part of the love for this podcast, is we get to sit down with folks who have been out there for a while, who have had the movie, had something, and we get to talk about, where'd you start, what inspired you, go back to what helped you. And it sounds like before you even sent in that first submission, you went above and beyond with workshops, going to creative writing courses, and building that critique partnership, and going through your paces and rejections through that stage.
Growing a thick skin, because the only way you're going to be able to deal with criticism is if you get a thick enough skin that it's not hurting that much. Now, it can hurt, even when you got as thick a skin as this. And I can sometimes be rude. I have a popular blog called Contrary Brin, which we'll link to. And there are some times when people come in and, are nasty, and I can lose my temper. But if you develop a thick enough skin to think of criticism as the food you need in order to get better, then that is the top advice of all.
That was awesome. Well, I think we're going to use that to end the podcast. That's what I think.
Yes, that's a good stopping point.
Okay, so what is the easiest way to reach you? What is where would you like us? I know we're going to do a lot of links, but where would you say you want fans to find you?
Well, I have a website, davidbrin.com, and I have a blog, Contrary Brin, and the comments section under that blog is one of the oldest and best bunch of erudite arguing guys. And I say that guys in the most generic sense. Several are trans people and all of that. So, but in any event, I expect your email. I'll fill in the blanks, and you guys combine brains and heart and such charisma.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It has been amazing having you on the podcast. So it has been David Brin. I'm Erica Lance.
And I'm Valerie Willis.
And we'll see you next time.